Joining us for today's webinar. We hope this presentation will deepen your understanding of addiction's impact on children and families and give you insights into the many issues that confront you and families in your congregations. We hope that today's webinar presenter, Reverend Fred Smoot, will help you to be more sensitive to the quiet suffering that plagues families in all congregations when a family member they love is caught up in the clutches of alcoholism or other drug dependencies. Dr. Smoot's topic, Sensitizing the Congregation, speaks for itself. Our hope is that this next hour will give you the information and motivation to support impacted children and families and find ways to reach out to them and help them to heal. During our two previous year-long webinar series, we have touched on addiction, its treatment, and the many paths to recovery, and on issues and needs of both young children and adult children of alcoholic parents. Last month, Dr. Claudia Black discussed with us the reverberations of addiction's impact in the family, addressing the multi-generational impact of the addiction of even just one person. Dr. Smoot will pick up with today's topic. My name is Sis Wenger, and I'm the President and CEO of NACoA, the National Association for Children of Alcoholics. We are hosting this free webinar series entitled Understanding Addiction and Supporting Recovery. The series is co-sponsored by the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, and the Entertainment Industries Council, which is providing the technical support for today's presentation. The entire series of 9 one-hour webinars is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Center for Substance Abuse Treatment. We are honored to have Reverend Fred Smoot with us today. He has long been an active member in the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, and he spearheaded a year-long process of integrating the core competencies for clergy and other pastoral ministers in addressing alcohol and drug dependence and the impact on family matters, a platform that has been used for all major clergy education training programs in the last 10 years. He helped integrate it into the CPE education across the country, and that education is the core training for chaplains. As you can imagine, there's a lot to cover in the next 55 minutes, so let me turn the program over to Reverend Smoot. Fred?
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Sis, for all that you've said about this great topic that we're going to look at today, sensitizing the congregation. When we start talking about sensitizing the congregation, we're talking about how do we move into the communities of faith to sensitize them around substance abuse, addiction, and its impact on our families. We need a next slide, please. So our purpose is to acknowledge the widespread impact of addictive process on our communities and our congregations, and to address the nature of the essential crisis within the family when it's captured by addiction, and to embrace ways to promote healing and recovery through the church's ministries. Next slide. We need to begin, and beginnings are very important, for beginnings set the foundation. So I'd just like to start with a moment, because we know somehow we need to begin. Mary Oliver has written a poem I want to share with you. It's called The Journey. Many of you know it. One day, you finally knew what you had to do, and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. Though the whole house began to tremble, and you left the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late, late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burst through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Let's acknowledge that within our congregations there are those persons and families who are captured by addiction. These things are important. Addiction is often a multi-generational disease. It's often hidden from the congregation's view by the nature of the disease itself, I might add. And within the family system itself, within the family where there is addiction process working, it's minimized. It has long-term devastating impact on family members and especially on children. It isolates its victims from the rest of the community. Next slide. So let's acknowledge that alcoholism is a disease, and it's often mislabeled, and its victims stigmatized by the notion that, quote, it's their own fault, quote. That kind of thinking. They'd say things like, what he or she is doing is a sin, and they are sinners for doing it. Or that if only he or she would have the willpower, they could stop drinking. And other misdirected judgments that disconnect the needed connection of those captured by alcoholism with the congregations of faith. We need to be careful to make sure we're connecting and not disconnecting or going one up on one another. Next slide. Let's acknowledge that some church members and some church bodies would separate themselves from the addict just as the addiction separates the person from the church. They would say, we love the sinner but hate the sin, and this judgment stems from retributive justice and not restorative justice. It is disconnected to the healing of the disease, and it cuts off the addict from the body of faith. Next slide. Let's acknowledge that every person and every system has addictive elements at work. And it's just a matter of degree, certainly not a difference of character. Let's acknowledge that the church has no claim in itself for moral high ground. It too has fallen far short. We too have fallen far short and stand in the need of healing and sustaining, guiding, reconciling, nurturing, forgiving. And if the congregation can get this truth about itself and is willing to let it guide it, to be present in the heart of God, there lies the hope for its own healing. Reconciliation and healing has a chance in such a mutual context. Next slide. Let's just acknowledge here in this painting that we're looking at here with Rembrandt's painting of the boat on the sea, that we're all in the same boat. I'm struck by this painting because Rembrandt painted himself in that desperate need to find the peaceful waters, that desperate need to find community. We're all in the same boat here. Next slide. See, I think everyone has something valuable to offer our faith journey together as the church. And the current condition of most churches is split. It's them and us. Yet here we are. Really, we need one another to grow and mature as persons of deeper faith. One of my friends in recovery said, I pray that one day the confessed addicted people downstairs on the folding chairs can meet the saved addicted people upstairs in the pews. Then we'll come to know both our real riches and our real poverty. Wow. Next slide. You see, for us as the community of faith, our spiritual healing is at stake in such a meeting. Until we find that common ground, that common table that connection in our real humanness, the church will remain stuck and ineffective in meeting this real challenge, this challenge we have with families impacted by addiction and alcoholism. And here it is. That's the core of what we must acknowledge if we're to meet our spiritual human walk together. I really wanted to say something also about it's much more like an Emmaus walk, as one author put it, than a Damascus experience. For it takes time and walking alone. Jesus met the two disciples leaving Jerusalem and walked with them and reminded them and suffered with them and was with them until they came to know him. That's more like what recovery is about. Next slide. For the core of true hospitality is the humility to seek and discover our connected humanity in all its parts in our brothers and sisters. In all our brothers and sisters. The core of true hospitality is to acknowledge it mutually, to see each other as we are, and come to accept that we're all a part of the family of God, and to embrace our own need for the same grace that we give. For as we invite and accept invitation to a shared life. Next slide. So it's about acknowledgement and confession. Our mutually shared humanity and spiritual journey, our own addictive process. So we would do well to ask ourselves, where is our shared humanity with the people in the folding chairs, for us in the pulpits, or in the education rooms, or working with youth? Where is our mutual shared spiritual journey? And we can come to know that only as we are willing to open up about our own addictive process. What's yours? What's mine? How can we share this together? Next slide. See, the ground of effectiveness, if we're going to use that term, is acknowledging one's own addiction, owning that some things tug at us and capture us, and in so doing control us. Our thinking, our emotions, our behavior, our character, our destiny. It controls all of those. If we don't have some way of being with that tug. Addiction lives here in all of us. Next slide. So we come to address it. Coming to terms with addiction in family. Let's look at some of the facts of the case, some of the data. That's what we're about. And coming to terms with it means that we come to face it, come to look at it, and let it move us. Next slide. For without naming it or identifying it or knowing it and its impact on families, addiction hides in the shadows behind closed doors, and that's where it maintains its power. Unshared, it takes us over. Addiction uses this cover to deteriorate our fundamental connections of faith, hope, and love of one another, and ultimately of life itself. Addiction parades as harmless or only slightly annoying while carrying seeds of deadly force. Next slide. It seems to me that we might need to have something about a working definition here of these things. And I find that James Royce's paraphrase from The Effects of Alcohol and Recovery, from Spirituality and Chemical Dependency, pretty well says this for us. Addiction is a systemic deconstruction that estranges, alienates, and sedates the self in relation toward the ultimate, with outcomes of disenchantment and loss of meaning for life experience. It's a mouthful, but the words are strong. Addiction estranges us, alienates us, and sedates us in relation towards the God as we know God. And the outcome is disenchantment and loss of meaning for life itself. Next slide. Next slide, please. For our work today, we need a more broad definition. The abuse of alcohol draws life away from life. Love of the bottle replaces love of oneself, love of others, spouses, children, family, love of God. And we who care for our kids and congregations, our community, have choices. We have choices here. Spirituality finds its genesis, says Paul Tillich, in Western culture as the existential awareness of non-being. Wow, that sounds like Paul Tillich. Anyway, I think it has something to do with the anxiety that we may not be, that we may not exist. Tillich called this ukon and meon in the Greek. And it's the awareness that's triggered by or manifests itself in the terms of loss or threatened loss of relationship with self, others, and God, and is grounded in the midst of history. I like this, where messy life events are being experienced and interpreted. You see, it takes it all away, and our spirituality becomes a victim of the addiction. Next slide. And when we see this, we begin to understand that we turn our love away from love itself to the love of an object of the bottle. The love of oneself deteriorates. The love of others, spouses, children, family, love of God. We need to begin to see the motivation in this for we who care for our kids, we who care for congregations and communities, have choices. We are not powerless as we act in community. Next slide, please. So I'd say it's time to stop pretending. Culturally, we've become deadened to the effects of substance dependence and misuse. It's seen as a time for fun. It's seen as something that does not have danger attached to it, or too much caution. And so many persons are hurt by the effects of substance use disorders that it seems to be almost too much when we look at it from another angle. And certainly, my friends, too many dollars are spent to seduce us away from a harsh fact. And as they say in AA, denial is such a convenient option. It's time to stop pretending. Next slide. Let's look at this just for a little motivation, that 94.4% of clergy consider alcohol and drug abuse and addiction an important problem. And yet only 12.5% had any coursework on the subject at seminary. Little wonder that we have trouble with it when it comes and knocks on our door, when those folks come to us. 22.5 million Americans ages 12 and older have diagnosable alcohol and drug dependence or abuse issues. That's a huge percentage. And the last one, this is the one that tugs at my heart. 1 in 4 children under 18 lives in a family with alcoholism or alcohol abuse. And countless others have drug-using parents. We need to do something about this. This tugs at us. Next slide. you begin to see that tobacco and alcohol have been used, or I should fill this in, misused, and find themselves in the percentage of population, very high percentages, much higher than marijuana, cocaine, or heroin, and yet devastating effects on the lives of those impacted by this misuse. Next slide. In doing some of the work with this, we come to understand that alcohol is related to both aspects of violence, perpetration, and victimization. Offenders were drinking in 86% of homicides, 60% of sexual offenses, 37% of assaults, 27% of females and 57% of males involved in marital violence, either as perpetrator or victim, and then 13% of child abuse cases where violence has become such that the law and enforcement have to become involved. Next slide. Next. So what can we see as pastors with this data? Well, let's just go over it. Substance misuse has been shown to lead to violence in the lives of individuals, families, and communities. Substance addiction diminishes and destroys all of our things together. We are finding ourselves our work in communities of faith to reconnect persons with their fundamental spirituality. This is what we can see. If our work is to reconnect persons, families, and communities with their fundamental spirituality, religion, reconnect, we need to be about the work of being with folks who are suffering in this diminished way. Next slide, please. Tangled relationships are an outcome, particularly with children who identify God as the image of mom or dad, and then that is so tangled by alcohol. Codependent behaviors of dependency and counterdependency and tied up in lack of boundaries, poor self-image, all contribute to the long-term effects. Instability of religious commitment, perhaps very important for us. For underdeveloped intrinsic values, children do not have an opportunity to find the values that will sustain them if they're working to just survive in an addicted family. Overcompensated with rigid behaviors or beliefs, underutilization of religious formation support system, inconsistent modeling and mentoring for children. These are the long-term effects with applications to spiritual development. Next slide, please. In a larger sense, substance misuse exacerbates all levels of violence. And in understanding this, we can understand many levels of our personal, family, community systems, and pastoral caregivers. Substance misuse devastates the spirituality of more than individuals. It impacts the system at every level. Next slide. Next slide, please. So when we said that 1 out of every 4 children lives in an addicted family, 19 million of them under age 18, growing up with addicted parents has enormous effects on children. It distorts reality. It interferes with the child's developmental process. It affects the child's self-esteem, ability to trust, intimate relationships, and mental health. All of these things call us to action. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Children of alcoholics may benefit from adult efforts to help them. Children of alcoholics can be protected from many problems associated with growing up in an alcoholic family. Next slide, please. So we have to ask ourselves here, as we reflect on this poignant picture, what kind of future are we wanting for our children and for our grandchildren? How are we going to be with this as the church and as concerned members of the church? Next slide, please. See, the captured families have rules. Don't talk. The wall of silence isolates family members from one another and others who can help them. Fear of being exposed and shame often keeps speaking out about it from occurring. Don't trust. This disease infects the family, and outsiders are seen as threats to the family's good image. Children learn not to trust others because they can't find a trustworthy source at home in their parents or with others in the disease. So much energy is put into keeping the family boat from overturning with an alcoholic. We need to be sure that the children have some kind of resilience around don't talk and don't trust. Breaking these rules may be a piece of the church's work. Next slide, please. Don't feel. If you don't feel it, it didn't occur. Don't die on feelings, abandonment, physical abuse, shame, or hope. Don't feel it. But if you cut off your feelings, you cut off your life experience itself. Rather than accepting one's feelings and exploring them and making them whole and a part of the wholeness of one's life, children have that cut off. Perhaps one of the more important things for us in church is to think about the family secret of the chaos in the home caused by the disease. Don't tell about it. Don't tell about a parental rage outburst, sexual abuse, or neglect. Perhaps most importantly, the inconsistencies that happen as a child tries to experience the constancy and consistency needed to grow up. Next slide, please. Robert Anda did a wonderful study on the ACE study on children as they grow up, and it confirmed Erik Erikson's earlier work on how parental substance abuse at developing life stages and how these impacted by alcohol, the life stages are arrested. It's not just the impact of the moment, but over the lifespan. And time alone does not heal these wounds. Next slide, please. Let's move to embracing, developing care for families and children through the church. What can we be about? How can we embrace this issue in our culture, in our families, and in those we love? Next slide, please. See, clergy are often the first contact that people may have. They may feel safe enough to contact us and say, I want to talk about something. Sis Winger said, pastoral ministry is in a unique position to help, but most have not had the opportunity to acquire the requisite knowledge and skills to do so, and they often feel inadequate to the task. Those statistics earlier before show how that happens. Very little education about working with addictive process. much needed as we move through our ministries and find these people, obviously, in our congregations. We need to have knowledge and skills for talking helps, skills help, information helps, build resilience. And these are available to prepare us for equipping the saints. As we come to the end of the webinar here in a few minutes, there are plenty of handouts that will help you find a way to do this. I wanted you to have them because it's so important to take for yourself. Next slide, please. We prepare ourselves. In 2005, NACoA published the outcomes of a national study group tasked to engage clergy and other pastoral caregivers with essential competencies in addressing alcohol and drug dependence and the impact on family members. As a part of this, I was moved and deeply moved by how that worked, how we worked together to say, what is it that pastors need to know? National pastoral care groups endorsed and utilized these competencies in training chaplains, pastoral counselors, and other clergy. That information and those competencies are available to you as you come to embrace this work. Next slide, please. The core competencies form the basic outline for seminary curriculum as well, and other caregivers. They're included in the appendix for your review and program planning. I would point to Spiritual Caregiving to Help Addicted Persons and Families, put out by SAMHSA, S-A-M-H-S-A, a handbook for use by pastoral counselors in clergy education, available through SAMHSA. And maybe most importantly, for clergy working in the parish, Preventing and Addressing Alcohol and Drug Problems, a handbook for clergy. I found this very helpful. In addition to this, NACoA has a series of classes one might take. So I want to take you to those websites and encourage you to look on www.nacoa.org, click on clergy and then certificate. I found that very helpful, not particularly time-consuming, but packed with intense information and good training. www.NAADAC.org also has that information for you. Next slide. What to do? One of the things I've discovered that really is important for us to understand is that a primer and resource for handbook for clergy and other pastoral ministers from the Tennessee Association of Alcohol, Drug, and Other Addiction Services said there are 10 considerations for clergy well looking at. I'll just briefly make it. Addiction is a disease. Treat it like one. You cannot fix it, so stop trying. You would not try to fix a diabetic. Treat this the same way. Consideration 3, learn your community's resources and refer to them. Think, refer, and defer. Make a list of 5 to 10 people, go-to people, and make those referrals. We don't need to do this by ourselves. We need to help the help of the community to know where it is. Consideration 4, learn as much as you can about your area's 12-step programs. Attend open meetings. Talk with individuals and family members in recovery. And read the AA Big Book, the Narcotics Anonymous NA Basic Text. Consideration 5, recognize that the traditional 12-step programs, although non-religious, have a strong spiritual element at their base. This, along with the supportive, non-judgmental community they create, is their strength. Consideration 6, after referral to 12-step programs, resist the temptation to rush the alcoholic or addict back into the church or synagogue or temple. Consideration 7, in addiction, as in life, there are few, as the Christian tradition, Damascus Road experiences. More often, recovery and return to the spiritual and religious life are more equated with the Christian gospel story of the Emmaus Road, as I said earlier. The lesson is that God is with us and at work all the time, even if we don't realize it. Consideration 8, understand the importance of educating and informing your congregation about alcohol, addiction, and recovery. Recognize that this is a family issue, says consideration 9, a family disease. Lastly, be aware of the message of hope. Break the rule of silence from the pulpit or other group platforms. Bridge the breach. Talk about drug and alcohol dependence. Bring it out into the light and treat it as a disease model rather than simply a sin model. It takes a faithful community to heal the disease, and one cannot heal in isolation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Have a recovering person speak to groups about their experience in recovery and offer hope. Support a recovery-friendly attitude in the congregation, often through small study groups. Let all persons know they can come to staff, to yourself, to others for resourced and confidential assistance. Think Al-Anon for spouses and adult children. It's a vital tool and resource for recovery of family life. Next slide, please. Educate, educate, educate. Information is the tool we have along with our person. For knowledge is power in recovery and in prevention. Groups where this can happen in the church. Youth groups, premarital counseling, couples groups, church class studies, newsletters under healthy lifestyle. Focus on needs of children of alcoholics with posters and flyers and talks. Those are all available through NACoA, www.NACoA. Look those up. You'll find that that's very helpful material. Next slide, please. And then it's all about relationships. Constantly, warmth, inclusion, empowerment. Those are the kinds of things that matter in the relationship, particularly with children and youth. Engage youth around healthy lifestyles, around safety and independence and being with one another, engaging community rules and authority, developing nourishing friendships across generational lines, a confident sense of oneself with others. Work with youth around conflict with adults, parents, and other persons for healthy ways to learn to work these things through. As adults, we can provide a healthy image and the kind of relationships which will build this kind of resilience. Next slide, please. Choosing adult leaders. Persons whose own maturity is available without being overly parental. You must sense they're willing to listen without judgment as they work out their life choices. Youth and children want someone to sit with them, not just to push them in the right direction, but to be present to them and care for them. And that maturity means that they know something about their own suffering and their own work and their own curiosity and their own edges. Children of alcoholics in particular are sensitive to phony, rule-bound adults who talk down to them. They also don't want buddies who will let them do whatever they please. Very important to find the kind of adult leaders who will be present and care deeply for children and youth. Next question. Next slide, please. Most children respond to non-smothering warmth. COAs take time to trust again. Have to keep working at it with many children of alcoholics. Most youth respond to real adults who make room for them with real interest in their lives and choices. And the task of these leaders is to develop resilience of character and strength of a sense of a worthy self. Next slide. You see, the core things for me is that the leaders need to provide a place of stability and constancy for folks whose contexts are often characterized by chaos and inconsistency from the adults that they live with. Church leaders working with children and youth must have a knowledge of the families into which they enter and be willing to stand up for the children and youth's well-being when things begin to fall apart. They can stand in the breach with the children and support the family as it comes into recovery. Next slide, please. I put this in because children and youth need to know these things. I didn't cause addiction. I can't cure it. I can't control it. But I can help take care of myself by communicating my feelings. I can make healthy choices. I can celebrate being myself. And as leaders, we can help these messages stick. And that's what matters. It matters that they have a sense of they are important. They didn't cause it, and they can't cure it. They can't control it, but they can take better care of themselves, and they can reach out to others to communicate and find those connections which will help them find stability and constancy. Next slide, please. Addiction is a disease. You did not cause it, nor can you control your parents' addiction. You are not alone. Others are here for you. And talking helps, particularly with someone who listens. Are you someone who listens? Next slide, please. You're not alone. This may be the fundamental message of faith. What we hear here are those echoed words, I will be with you in all that you will do. I will not leave you comfortless. I will bear you up. And I want you to know as leaders that you are not alone in coming to this moment of making choices to be present to those who are captured by addiction and their families. There are many resources available to you in your congregation. I've listed a number in the resources and many more available online. Most are free. I'll make a few recommendations. Next slide. Here you are. Some helps for beginning a ministry to families captured by the addictive process. Let's look at these together. Next slide. Pastor's personal work. I want you to take a look at that 10 considerations for clergy. Richard Rohr's book, Breathing Underwater. It's a wonderful text for one's own growth. And a first-hand account of the journey through by James Nelson. Some of you know of him as a professor. Those are for your personal work. Next slide. For your professional work, Preventing and Addressing Alcohol and Drug Problems, the handbook I talked about earlier. And then resource guides from NACoA, extensive reading lists in the clergy section and others, and the lists are right there and available to you. I'm going to turn this back over now and to let the rest of this come to you as you can see it and have it for your professional development. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Fred. For the hundreds of participants on this webinar, let me extend our deepest thanks to you for what you have shared with us today. Your insights will help all of us to have a deeper understanding of what simple steps can be taken at the congregational level to address addiction's deleterious effect on the addicted person and on family members, and gives us a stronger motivation to step up and do what we can. I want to comment for a moment on the slides here. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, has a national helpline. I think every congregation in the country probably wants to have this hotline available. It's 365 days a year, 24/7, in 2 languages, and people who are calling simply for information and tools that SAMHSA produces can get them by calling there, but people who need guidance on where they can find help in their local community can also get that help at that telephone or at the national helpline. SAMHSA also has a Recovery Month at recoverymonth.gov, which is filled with resources that congregations can use to celebrate recovery during September, which is Recovery Month. And then at the website samhsa.gov recovery, it has recovery and recovery support pieces. Next slide, please. This is how you can contact NACoA. Dr. Smoot mentioned it several times. We have been chairing the Clergy Education and Training Project for about 11 years now, and facilitated bringing together religious leaders at various times to craft how seminary curriculum could be developed, to craft that handbook that Dr. Smoot mentioned, where the 10 considerations are listed. That handbook is available on our website as well, and you can find those 10 considerations in the book. And we have a question about where we can get the book as well. Again, it's on that website. There's another tool that's available. Dr. Smoot talked about education in the congregation. We have a training, what we call a training toolkit for spiritual caregiving to help addicted persons and their family members. It has a handbook that helps people to understand the blend of fostering addiction recovery and spirituality. It comes from both of those vantage points, and it was integrated together. The handbook is a superb background reading for anybody who wants to use the manual to do a course. Any congregation could get that manual from us. Has all the lesson plans and the handouts and the reading materials to give a fairly good basic course that covers those 10 core competencies that Dr. Smoot mentioned. All of those are available by contacting us at one of these telephone numbers. I also want to refer you back to the website and the previous webinars. If you've missed those in previous years, they're all archived for free viewing at your convenience at NACoA.org, and you are welcome to access them at any time. I have a few questions for you, Dr. Smoot, if you could take them.
All right.
At this point, one of the questions is about something you said early on about naming it, identifying it, knowing it, and its impact on families. That addiction hides in the shadows behind closed doors. And the question was, related to that statement, is what can the church in general, the global church, do to bring families out from under the shadows, and what specifically could a congregation do, could a pastor do? You touched on it at the end when you talked about breaking the wall of silence and about touching on it in sermons, but could you be a little more specific about things that can help bring children and families out of the shadow?
I think it's important to start with talking about it in the congregation normal, rather than playing into the secret or playing into the funny myth that we wouldn't have those people in our congregation. So first of all, the normalization of talking about these kinds of things that are right in our midst becomes increasingly important. And that comes in all sorts of ways of doing it. I think for churches, Wednesday night suppers, good place to start. The pulpit at a particular time of the month that we have set aside, nationally to look at this. The other piece that strikes me is a study group that can take a look at what it is to be a part of understanding addictions. My CPE group has spent the last 12 weeks working with Richard Rohr's book, Breathing Underwater, as we looked at the 12 steps and looked at ourselves as we're developing in ministry. A study group of adults looking at something like that, looking at also resources that I found helpful with the book that NACoA puts out and SAMHSA puts out, the Preventing and Addressing Alcohol and Drug Problems in small groups in the church, study groups. This handbook for clergy also would be good for a study group of adults doing this. It is about preparing persons in the church who are able to say, this is what my mission is about, and looking for those adults who are bringing it out of the shadows by normalizing it and bringing it into study in the church as well. It's also about putting things like in the church that say, you're welcome here. Please come be a part of this. It's about having somebody come and talk to the youth or the adults who is a recovering addict themselves, who has had some time in sobriety. It offers hope. I'm sure that others, could find these as well, could find other resources. Those are the ones that come to mind. I think we just have to bring it out and talk about it and make it normal rather than just letting it hide.
Thank you. I have a question that actually came up once last year in one of the programs. The question is, how does a congregation address addiction that has captured the spiritual leader? This happened in my synagogue. And I think that is an issue that we will frequently hear. My pastor, my rabbi, has a drinking problem. What can we do about it? Mm-hmm. So let me hand you that.
Yeah, okay, I'll take a shot at it here. I think it's important for church leaders to support their pastors. You don't support them by hiding issues that they may need to be a part of. In working where I did at Emory Clergy Care for 13 years, I ran into several pastors who were struggling with addiction. Part of this has to do with the congregation bringing it to the attention of leaders who have a sense that it's a disease and not a deal breaker. It's a disease that needs to be addressed over time and can be addressed by leaders and brothers and sisters in the ministry. The larger context of resources being made available to pastors in recovery is growing, but we need to be able to tap into it and not get stuck into the sense of only we're the ones that can do something about it. We can reach out to the community resources and say, this is a human being that's been captured by a disease, and we need to be helpful to them in the ways that are there. Another piece about this is that of ourselves we cannot do something, but we can rely on those professionals in the community who work with persons captured by this and find a way to work with them that maintains the integrity and the dignity of the people involved. I think that's very important. Larger church ministries have done that. In the Methodist connection, district superintendents have often taken on and brought ways to bear to help pastors and at the same time help the congregation come to terms with these things.
For our audience today, I guess I should add that one of our later presentations will be by two national experts on family intervention, and certainly a professional could help congregational lay leaders in addressing this issue in the kind and caring way that you have described. So that would be another thing for them to look at, I would think.
Absolutely. Well said.
One of the first questions that we had today was a question that says, does sensitizing congregations take into consideration the difference between religion and spirituality? The 12-step programs state they are not religious.
Well, I think that, yes, I believe that that's right, that the 12-step program rightly separated out religion from spirituality in the sense that a person really has, in coming into recovery, been often hurt by religious leaders who use some of the things I talked about earlier in the lecture, what I call retributive or dualistic thinking. Richard Rohr's book makes a fine distinction of that. And I think that the spirituality that we find is a different kind of way of being in the world. And spirituality is much more about how we find a way to restore a person rather than to judge them. And I think religion and spirituality have a place for one another. And it seems to me like that's an important issue to take on in the adult study work that we do, and in the pastor's own understanding of how to come to a person offering restoration and not judgment.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Thank you. I have a couple more questions. And the person who sent a question that was very specific to California and foster care and state law, if you would email us and identify yourself, we would certainly be happy to see what we could find for you. Dr. Smoot, you've been very helpful today and very inspirational. Thank you very much. To all of our listeners, you know there are 9 webinars in this series. We invite you now to mark your calendars for the 3rd, which will feature Dr. Kimberly Jeffries, the Deputy Director of the Federal Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, on April 14th, and you'll be receiving a notice from us about that. She is going to address the epidemic of opioid use and addiction, especially among young people in communities across the country, in our cities and countryside, among young people from privileged families, and among poor, jobless young people. The devastation that is being wreaked on families of these individual young people will be addressed, as well as treatment and recovery options that are beginning to be available. So please join us on April 14th for another enlightening presentation. Finally, when you close your viewing window for this live webinar, a new window will automatically pop up where you will have the opportunity to provide us with feedback about the presentation. Please take a few moments to give us your feedback. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. I want to thank Entertainment Industry Council and the women behind the scenes here, Sean and Marlia. They have done a terrific job in training us and hosting this electronically for us today, and thank you very much. Good luck to everybody. We'll be glad to help anyone who's looking for the materials that Dr. Smoot has mentioned if you contact us. Thank you very much.